Hi everyone. So this video is going to be focusing on tips for controlling the placement of objects in random maps. So these tips are things that I've learned over my experience scripting that I can't find better explanations for elsewhere. So in no particular order, the first thing I wanted to mention was terrain restrictions. So if you're familiar with the game, it's only intuitive to see that you can't place every single object anywhere you want. See, this unit is restricted for water, and say we have a building here that'll be restricted for shallow, it'll be restricted for beach, water, but you can place it elsewhere. That's pretty natural. So what I did in the past was I put together this little spreadsheet of all the different terrains in the game and to see what types of objects can be placed there and what terrains are restricted. So that's a little tool that I'll provide for download in the description. So that being said, why is that important? So let's go to a sample map here. Alright, so this is the sample map, and let's take a look at its code. So test 2. So we have a object statement here. It's creating a gold for every single player in the game. And we see that in the map, 1 gold is generated per player here, 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 and here. So there's 1 per island. And that's what I want to call the first tip for placing objects in random maps, is that you cannot place a player object in an area that's separated by a restricted terrain. So since shallows is a restricted terrain for gold, nothing can be placed outside of this area here. Since the entire thing is surrounded by shallows, the gold can't be placed here since it's separated by a restricted terrain. So what if we change that object to something that's not restricted for shallows? Say we wanted to place sheep for every player. And since sheep are not restricted to shallows, they can be placed anywhere. So they don't appear 1 group per island. And in a similar fashion, there is an attribute that object commands can have, that is place on specific land ID, and that can be defined in the land generation section above. So this land is what's the dirt in the middle, and it has a land ID attribute of 1. So if I match that with this, it's supposed to place all the objects on the dirt in the middle. But we see that it doesn't necessarily do that. See, it places it here, places it wherever. And that's because this attribute here, place on specific land ID, only works if there is separation from the players by a restricted terrain. So if I change this from sheep back to gold, you see it'll always spawn in the middle there, since shallows are a restricted terrain for gold, and there's separation there from the player lands. And you might be thinking that this sort of attribute is useful, but you could have also done it, say, with a terrain attribute, say place on specific terrain and specify dirt. But the advantage of using a land ID is that it won't be specific to a certain terrain. We could have like some sort of aesthetic thing going on here, and it'll still place gold on this land regardless of what terrain it ends up being. So with these tips in mind, let's take a look at a more specific example. So this map is called Oasis Bases. There was a tournament played on this map not too long ago, And the complaint that people had was that the deer placement on the map was very random. And the way this map was set up, that there's this grass area here that belongs to the players, surrounded by this ring of beach terrain, and with desert on the outside. So, in this map, the deer code looks like this. It was set scaled to player number instead of this, which would be set place for every player. Because if we did that, then there would be no deers appearing whatsoever. And then that goes to the first rule. Since beach terrain is a restricted terrain for deers, and since the player lands are separated from this outside by that restricted terrain, there's no way to place the deers there. And so that was what I did in the first version of the map. But then what I did later was I took this and added connections. And we can see what this did here is now that there's a tiny strip of beach terrain that connects the player base to this ring of beach that's around. And if we look, we can see that it placed deer there, 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 and similarly for every single player in the game. So now in this version, since technically now the player lands are this beach terrain, it's no longer the case that the outside is separated by a restricted terrain. Rather, it's adjacent to the player lands, just as this inner zone is adjacent to the player lands as well. So that's one example, and we can go to another example, which is a water map. So this is called Blue Hole, and the way this was set up is that player lands here are made of this grass terrain, while there's a ring of beach around this for a nice aesthetic effect. And the goal of this map was to have a personal transport ship for every single player in the game, and that code is here. But you place it on deep water, and you can see that no transport ships get placed. And that goes back to the first rule again. Since desert terrain is a restricted terrain for any water object, there's no way to place it on the water because of that separation here. And we can see that if we do a similar thing here, we add connections, we can see transport ships get placed. Since the player lands here are now technically desert, the adjacent terrain is no longer restricted to transport ships. Neither is this, neither is this, neither is this. Nothing until we get to deep water. So that's how that works. And now, if we go to yet another example here, this map is called Jaguar Den. So the object of this map is to place a bunch of jaguars in the middle of the map. And that is done using a land ID attribute. So we can see at the top that this middle land is created by a land ID attribute of 1. And if we go to the object section, we can see that this Jaguar code has attribute of place on specific land ID, which matches the land we did. And you got to notice here that this entire area is surrounded by beach terrain. And since beach terrain is a restricted terrain for jaguars, this attribute makes it possible for these to be placed here, in spite of having a lot of aesthetic terrain things going on, so we don't need a terrain statement. So this is the way the map is supposed to look, but I've seen it happened before, that if a player, for example, spawns too close to the middle, it might replace the beach terrain with some sort of other terrain. And just to simulate that, I'll have another connection generation section here, replacing beach with desert. And now if we take a look at this, we can see that there's some strip of desert terrain that connects the player lands to this middle terrain here, and we can see that jaguars are no longer restricted to this middle terrain because of this connection. Alright. One of the bigger problems in random maps is the fact that objects can be placed, resources, in places where players cannot access them. So this is an exaggerated version of Arabia. I just increased the number of groups for the secondary sheep to simulate all the different possible locations where you could possibly place it. And you can see that it's possible to place sheep here in this oasis where players can't get to it, and that's a problem. So how do we go about fixing this? So we can go back to here. So we can go to another test map here. So essentially, I've covered this map with a lot of gold piles. And one of the attributes in an object command is this one right here. Max distance to other zones. And the wording of that can be a little misleading, since it's actually, first of all, a minimum distance instead of a maximum. And zones here may lead you to think that it has something to do with land generation, where you define zone here. But that's not necessarily the case. A more accurate wording would be the minimum distance to a restricted terrain. So if I change this max distance to other zones to 10, you can see that since gold is restricted for this terrain, it'll stay at least 10 tiles away from that. And since it's restricted for beach, it'll stay 10 tiles away from that. Same with ice. And unfortunately, there are always exceptions to some rules. Even though gold is restricted to be placed on road, it still won't stay 10 tiles away from that. But say we wanted to change this here to sheep, we can make it avoid water by a certain distance. And that's helpful to know. But say, for example, you had an issue with a certain resource being trapped in a clump of trees. We can change road to, let's say, forest, and that's kind of an issue, since if we go back to this, we can see that land units aren't exactly restricted to forest terrain, since if we go to delete all the objects here, it's still possible to place it there. But there is a way to get around this, which I will show here. Let's go back. So this will be done using an object called a map revealer. So a map revealer is sort of a special object in the sense that it doesn't take up any space, which means we can place it on forest terrain. So we'll do that, place it on forest terrain, and place this one on palm desert. And this will be set as a Gaia object, and we can be able to tell that it's able to be placed on forest terrain. We can test this. Natural we can see that the forest is revealed, which means we were able to place stuff there. And that's what we were trying to do, so that's good. And we can go quit this. Alright, so let's take a look at this again. So this map revealer placed a lot of objects on forest terrain. Now, what we have here is this attribute saying min distance group placement is 5. And this attribute means that every object placed after this line of code will stay at least 5 tiles away from that. So we can see forage bushes are created after that, gold, stone resources are sheep, and if we go back to random map, this map here, we can see now that all objects placed after those map revealers will stay a certain distance away from the forest, so that nothing gets trapped in Oasis here, and that's a good thing. And we can do similar things for cliffs. So if you recall that whenever you place a cliff in a random map, it generates this terrain underneath it. So if we place map revealers on this specific terrain, we can get objects placed after that to avoid the cliffs as well. So we go back here, scroll up to wherever we have our map revealers, and instead of Palm Desert, that's going to be set to this constant here, which is number 16. We can scroll down here, place Palm Desert with the cliff grass, go here, and we can see that nothing's getting trapped in cliffs either. So that's a good thing. So those were my tips for the controlling of the placement of objects in random maps. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned something.